So, Giotto is the next artistic superstar when we talk about Florence. He was a student of Cimabue's and he apprenticed with Cimabue in the latter half of Cimabue's career. He really surpasses his teacher's representation of the humanistic form. He accomplishes this by drawing from live models, which really hadn't been done for a couple centuries at this point. He also works among the Franciscan monks. They believed in a simple, humble life that emphasized more of a direct experience with God. And so that direct experience with God is more relatable if God is a human and here on earth. Art historians believe that the life of the Franciscans really influenced Giotto's style, and the way that Giotto emphasized humanism even more than Cimabue. So I ask you, how does Giotto influence, or how does Giotto represent the humanistic form? I hope that the first thing you said was by using hierarchy of scale. You can see here that the Madonna takes up most of, at least 50% of the icon. She's very large. If she stood up, she would be massive compared to the size of the human beings that sit at her right and sit at her left. He represents her in this structure. The architectural structure that she sits in, the throne, is much more angular than the one that we saw of Cimabue's. That angle helps us to understand perspective, and it's a much more convincing recession of space. Additionally, he uses naturalism. Naturalism is a more realistic looking human attribute. Here, it's in the faces. You can see the detail of the face is much more naturalistic looking. It looks like a real person's face, even though it's the face of an angel. Naturalism is sort of a new technique in terms of artistic representation, because prior to this they had been using a more streamlined representation of the face, meaning that the individualism that you see in the face of the angel isn't the same as what you see in the Gothic sculptures. This person's face looks the way it really is in real life, whereas in the sculptures that we see from the Gothic era, they're less individualized. You can't tell them apart quite as readily as you would Giotto's figure. In addition to, Giotto's figure looks like someone that you could pick out on the street. That person really exists in real life. The sculptures that we look at from the Gothic era don't look as if that person is someone that you could pick out of a crowd. We see even more readily how Giotto creates a more humanistic form when you compare Cimabue's work directly with Giotto's. So when we compare the two pieces, we see that while they both use hierarchy of scale and they both have very similar subject matter, that is the Mother Mary sitting with Jesus on her lap, the architectural space that Cimabue surrounds Mary with is very different than the one that surrounds Giotto's Mary. It is because of the architectural surrounding that we understand the space more so in Giotto's icon. Additionally, if you look at where the angels stand, the angels in Giotto's work look directly at Mary. In Cimabue's work, the angels look out at you, the viewer, which makes the work of art feel less humanistic. Why? Because when something important is happening in front of you, most everybody is directing their attention towards the thing that's most important. If all of a sudden some heavenly being came down and dropped in your middle of your living room, you would likely be looking at the heavenly being and not at the person who's coming to your front door. In addition to the donor portraits are the two angels that sit at the right, or that kneel at the right and left of Mary's throne. Those angels also look directly at Mary, whereas the donor portraits in Cimabue's work look directly out at you, the viewer. Cimabue's work recedes into space, and we can tell so by the way that he utilizes the ellipses in the composition, the way he repeats the shape of the tread of the stair receding into space, whereas Giotto's tread of the stair seems to really recede into space through this idea of the ledge. In Giotto's composition, we don't see as much of the cushion that Mary sits on. Why? Because Mary is so very large that the cushion that she's sitting on sort of is tucked under the entire weight of her body, whereas in Cimabue's we see a lot more of the cushion, and it makes Mary feel less weighty. That less weighty feeling has a sense of otherworldliness to it. While Giotto's career begins in Florence, he was soon known throughout Italy. His Florence commission wins him a commission in Padua and a commission in Rome. The commission that he was awarded in Padua was for a powerful family who was part of an oligarchy named the Scrovingis. The chapel was restitution for the family's usury. Because the commission of works of art in the chapel, because of the commission of the works of art in the chapel, the Pope pardons the Scrovingis from the charge of usury in 1303. The chapel was there to remind the family of their sins and to help them follow a more pious path of living. At the time, usury was punished by death. So before we talk about the Arena Chapel, let's figure out what a few things mean. There are two types of fresco painting. One is called buon fresco, which is true fresco. This is the type of fresco painting that was used by Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. It is when an artist uses a powdered pigment and mixes it into the plaster that's going to be used to create the wall. It's the pigments applied to the wet plaster. And so as the wall dries, the painting becomes literally part of the wall. To see how this is done, you can copy and paste this YouTube link that I've included for you. The other type of fresco painting is called secco fresco, and it's painting that's done on top of the plaster wall. The plaster wall has already cured, and it isn't part of the wall itself. This, type of fresco painting, buon fresco, is looked at as being a more artistic way to paint fresco. It's also looked at as being harder skill to master than secco fresco. Another term we're going to talk about is grisaille. Grisaille are these gray-looking here's an exterior shot of the Arena Chapel in Padua, also known as the Scrivingi's Chapel. Enrico Scrivingi was the son of the father and son banking business team that was accused of usury. He was also the person responsible for commissioning the chapel's art. And so you see him pictured here as the donor, just like we've seen in other paintings that represent the donor in the work of art. Here's a shot of the Arena Chapel standing at the entrance. You can see the paintings that are on the walls from the right and the left side. They are done in the chapel. The chapel itself is a large barrel vault. And there are places to kneel for prayer. Here you can see a little bit more close-up of the paintings on the left side of the chapel wall, as well as you get a better idea of where those grisaille figures were in the chapel. They were in the lowest register. They would have been parallel to the person who was in the chapel kneeling in front of the altar. These chapels were private chapels. They were chapels that were solely for the purpose of the family to go sit and pray. They're public chapels now, but then they would have been a place to sit and pray and contemplate good and bad deeds. Here you see a detail of one of the wall panels that was painted by Giotto. We will concentrate on the painting in the lower left corner of the section. This painting in the lower left corner is called The Lamentation. It depicts Jesus' followers at the time that he was taken from the cross before he was laid to rest in the tomb. The innovative thing that Giotto has done in this painting has to do with the balance and distribution of the figures. So let's look at the next slide closely. See if you feel that the composition is balanced, and think about why or why not you feel that the composition is balanced. So this is Giotto's The Lamentation from the Arena Chapel. It's that fresco that I told you we were going to hone in on. One of the things I wanted to share with you in terms of definitions is modeling. Modeling is the way in which the artist creates a volume to the figure. So you can see that the dark shadows are placed on the figure to the right, and that the light comes from the upper left-hand corner of the image. As the light shines on, let's say, the back of the figure that is in green closest to the picture plane, you can see that the light creates a highlight on the back as well as that shadow. That's how we determine how an object recedes into space. If there's no light source and the shadow isn't clear, you don't know where the light hits the human, and you also don't know where the weight within the object is. We'll see many examples of this, so you'll get more and more used to picking that out. This is Giotto's Lamentation, and the major innovation that we see here in Giotto's Lamentation has to do with the way in which he distributes space in the Lamentation. You see the diagonal rock that cuts through the picture plane? It sort of bisects it from one section to the other. And instead of bisecting it in half or horizontally, it does it diagonally. This is an illustration technique that Giotto is using to draw attention to the main thing that's happening here, which is the grieving over Jesus's body before he's laid to rest in the tomb. You can see through the gestures of the people that this is a very dramatic scene. For example, the woman who's bended over I guess it's a male figure, I'm sorry, who's bended over looking at Jesus with her hands behind her in this grand gesture that imitates the way in which the rock runs through the composition. You have a woman at Jesus's feet looking at the holes from the cross. You have Mary holding Jesus, grieving over his body. There's a woman standing above Jesus's head, looking at the scene, and a woman to her right, gesturing in prayer with her hand underneath her cheek, sort of beside herself in grief. Above this scene, you see this big space of blue. Within that big space of blue, there are lots of little cherubs flying above the scene. Those cherubs represent the heavenly world coming down to witness the death of Jesus. There's another thing that we have in this composition. It's called a giornata. The giornata is the line that's created when the artist lays the plaster in the painting on the wall. Most of the time, the artist uses that line to create an edge, for example, where the clothing meets the edge of the rock would be a giornata. But in the case of backgrounds, sometimes it's difficult to get the exact same color when you are mixing the plaster and the pigment. If you've ever painted before, you really do know that this is true. You mix a color, and you're never going to get that exact same color again. And so plaster dries fairly quickly. And in order to get it on the wall and get the section of the wall accomplished, you have to apply it fairly rapidly, which means you don't want to mix a really big batch of blue plaster up because it'll dry before you get it all on the wall. So placing the patch of plaster on the wall usually represents an entire day's worth of work in fresco painting. The giornata is created when the next day it happens, you come in and lay another section of plaster. I am going to point out in the next slide the giornata. This is another one of the panels in the Scrivingi Chapel. It's called The Kiss of Death, or The Kiss of Judah, by Giotto. It's one of the most moving panels that Giotto paints within the chapel. It was a scene in which Judas betrayed Jesus. The scene was no doubt intended to remind the Scrivingi family of their usury sin. You see Judas, he's identifying Jesus by kissing him on the cheek. The angry mob surrounds him. They raise their clubs to him, but they also carry torches to illuminate the scene. Not only do they carry torches, Giotto makes them very angular. He creates drama by using these diagonal lines that point you to the center important part of the scene, which is Judas giving Jesus a kiss, giving Jesus up as, or identifying Jesus to the Roman officials. We see the Roman soldiers wearing typical Roman soldier garb. It is shorter in length than the ones that Jesus and the Christian people wear. You can also see the dramatic modeling that Giotto develops within the composition. So what we saw prior to this, we saw modeling, but the great depth that Giotto gets comes from this illuminated light source The illuminated light source is a bit like the candle illuminating a dark room. And so you get this more dramatic effect of highlighting and darkness within the composition. Also, he places Jesus in the center of the composition and Judas in the center of the composition. This placement draws the eye directly to Judas giving up Jesus. That act becomes very dramatic and the most important information within the scene because he places it in the middle. The angry mob very much looks like a mob would here on Earth. You can only see the tops of people's heads, and you can see the shadows on the ground that the light creates by using the torchlight. There is a rhetorical question here to the side. Can you spot anything else that makes the scene feel so very powerful?